The fire had burned low, and in that particular London dark that comes only in the hour before Christmas dawn, when the frost has bitten deep enough to make even the fog crisp and brittle, 221B Baker Street was holding its breath. Not from tension, from cold. The kind of cold that sits inside walls and floorboards and refuses to leave until spring, and even then only under protest. It was the cold of a city unprepared for mercy, of ancient brick and mortar that had learned over centuries to accept suffering as a permanent condition. Dr. John Watson had not meant to be awake at this hour. He had retired at 11:30 with the settled certainty of a man whose habits had calcified into routine. The careful removal of his waistcoat, the laying out of his clothes for morning, the brief consultation of his pocket watch to confirm that sleep was, mathematically speaking, still available to him if he simply closed his eyes and allowed it to come. He had managed a respectable 4 hours before his mind, that faithful but inconvenient companion, had simply decided that sleep was no longer required. The decision had come without negotiation. One moment he was dreaming of something warm and indistinct, a garden, perhaps, or a woman's face he could not quite place, and the next moment he was awake, staring at the ceiling of his room, listening to his own heartbeat as if it were the heartbeat of the house itself. He lay in the dark for 20 minutes, no more, before he rose. There was no point in fighting it. He had learned long ago that sleep once departed does not easily return to a man who chases it. Better to rise, to move, to give the body something to do while the mind sorted itself out. He pulled on his dressing gown, wool, worn soft from years of wear, carrying the smell of tobacco and the indefinable scent of Baker Street itself, and made his way downstairs. The house was silent. Mrs. Hudson was long asleep, her rooms at the back of the house sealed off from the sounds of the street. Holmes, if he'd returned at all from his mysterious errands, was giving no indication of it. Watson climbed the stairs cautiously, aware of the particular creaks in the floorboards that would betray his passage if anyone were listening, but there was only silence. Only the settling sound of an old house in winter, the whisper of wind through cracks in the windows, the occasional groan of pipes as the cold worked its way deeper into the building's bones. The sitting room was where he found his refuge. The fire had not been entirely extinguished. Holmes had learned over the years to bank it carefully so that it would hold heat through the night without requiring Mrs. Hudson's attention, and it still held enough warmth to make sense of an insomniac's journey. Watson stirred it gently with the poker, careful not to disturb it too much, and added a small piece of coal. The coal caught slowly, reluctantly, as if it too were reluctant to wake. There was a book in the chair by the hearth. Malthus, something forbiddingly economic. But Watson knew better than to attempt reading at this hour. Reading required a kind of attention that his mind was simply not capable of providing. Instead, he settled into the chair, pulled a blanket over his knees, and wrapped his hands around an empty cup. He had forgotten to bring it filled, but the possession of the cup itself was comfort enough. It gave his hands something to do. It suggested the possibility of tea, even if no tea was forthcoming. The room itself was familiar enough to need no light. He knew every ridge of mortar in the chimney breast, every shadow cast by the furniture. He could navigate it in absolute darkness if required, had done so, in fact, during the case of the speckled band, though that seemed like a lifetime ago now. He had sat in this chair through many sleepless hours, after the war, during cases that would not resolve in the long aftermath of disappointments that made no sense at the time and only slightly more now. The room held those vigils in its walls and floorboards. It knew him the way places know people who sit in them long enough, not intimately, but with a kind of resigned familiarity. The window that looked out onto Baker Street was beginning to silver at the edges. It was still deeply dark, full dark, the absolute dark that comes only in the deepest part of the night, but there was a quality to the blackness that suggested dawn was not impossibly far away. Perhaps 3 hours, perhaps 4. The night was beginning to think about ending. It was the sound that came first. Not a loud sound, not a knock at the door, not a crash, not the kind of noise that would drive a man to immediate alarm and the reaching for whatever weapon came to hand. Rather, it was the sound of something finding its way past Mrs. Hudson's defences, the creak of the front door opening, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was opening it had done this before, and knew exactly how slowly the hinges needed to move to avoid generating noise. Then the softer creak of it closing again, The sound of a door being closed quietly by someone who understood that quiet was essential. Watson set down his cup. The empty cup made a soft clink against the arm of the chair, and he immediately regretted it, but whoever was in the house downstairs gave no indication of having heard it. Instead, there came the sound of footsteps in the hallway below. Someone was moving through the house. Someone who had not knocked. Someone who had keys or who had chosen the lock with considerable care and skill. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. They moved with caution. The caution of someone ascending a staircase in absolute darkness, feeling their way by hand and memory and hope. There was something rehearsed about it. Whoever this was, they had been here before and known where the steps would creak. Watson found himself counting the steps without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. Listening for the particular groan of the third step from the bottom, which had been loose for months and which Holmes had never bothered to have repaired. It came right on schedule. The intruder stepped over it, knowing exactly where it was. The footsteps stopped at the first-floor landing. There was a moment of absolute silence, the kind of silence that feels heavy, that feels like it is made of something physical. Held breath, gathered courage, the particular quiet that comes when someone is standing very still on the threshold of doing something that terrifies them. Then, with a sound so soft it might have been imagination, something was placed on the doormat outside the sitting room, paper rustling, the faint clink of tin, metal on wood, something solid, something that had been carried from somewhere else and left here, in this house, at this hour of the night when decent people were sleeping, and only the guilty, the desperate, and the insomniac were awake. Watson rose from his chair with infinite care. He did not make a sound. His bare feet, he had forgotten to put on his slippers, and the floorboards were cold enough to make him regret it, made no noise on the floor. The blanket fell away, the empty cup was abandoned on the arm of the chair, and then nothing from the landing. No retreat. The person simply stood there, outside the door, breathing quietly on the other side of wood and distance and the full weight of whatever secret they were carrying. Watson could hear them breathing. It was the breathing of someone who had just completed a terrible task and was waiting to see if the world would strike them down for it. The breathing of someone who was afraid. Watson did not open the door immediately. He simply stood there, listening, aware that opening the door would be an act of commitment. Once opened, the door could not be closed on this moment. The mystery would begin, and mysteries, in his experience, had a way of gathering momentum once they were acknowledged. Instead, he remained still, listening to that breathing on the other side of the wood, waiting to see what would come next. He heard it then, a gathering of something, courage, perhaps, or despair. A sound that might have been a small sob, quickly suppressed, and then the footsteps began their retreat. Down the stairs, not hurried, but not lingering either. The sound of someone who had done what they came to do, and now needed to be away from this place, away from the consequences of their own boldness. Down the stairs, across the hall. The front door opening, that same careful slowness, and then closing. The sound of a lock being engaged from outside, the sound of a key turning, the sound of London swallowing a secret hole. Watson waited perhaps 30 seconds more, counting silently, letting his heart slow. Then he opened the door. The hallway was empty. The darkness was absolute. But on the doormat, just catching the faintest glimmer from the fire behind him, that dying fire, those last coals keeping their vigil, sat a rectangular tin, biscuit tin size, the kind that comes filled with gingerbread or shortbread, or the sort of confection that people give each other at Christmas and then eat while no one is looking. It was wrapped in brown paper, tied with string, ordinary string, the kind used in grocers' shops, the kind that costs a penny a ball and that anyone could purchase, and on top of the tin, traced in white icing in a careful, trembling hand, was a row of symbols. Not words, symbols. The symbols were repeated across the surface of the tin multiple times, creating a pattern that covered most of the top. A circle, a dash, a cross, another circle, a longer dash, and then a shape Watson did not recognize, something between a star and a broken heart. The pattern repeated 3 times across the tin surface, each repetition slightly smaller than the last, as if the creator had been practicing, had been working her way towards something perfect. Each symbol was rendered with obvious care, the kind of care that only comes when someone is working with hands that are shaking. The icing had been applied thickly enough that some of it had begun to crystallize, catching the faint light and throwing it back like tiny mirrors. Watson picked up the tin. It was warm to the touch, recently baked then, recently boxed, recently brought through the London streets by someone whose hands shook as they iced this message, whatever it was meant to convey. The warmth told a story. The gingerbread was perhaps an hour old, maybe less. Someone had spent the evening baking, the darkness just after sunset. Someone had worked methodically, carefully, preparing this gift with extraordinary deliberation. He stood in the hallway, bare feet going numb on the cold floor, turning the tin in his hands. The brown paper crackled softly at the movement. The symbols caught different angles of light, revealing themselves in different ways depending on how he tilted the tin. A circle, a dash, a cross, a circle, a longer dash, a star-broken heart. And then the pattern repeated again and again, as if the sender had been determined that her message be rendered in multiple ways, as if she wanted to ensure it would be understood no matter how it was approached. With the kind of resignation a man acquires when he has been married to mystery long enough to recognize it as a way of life, Watson turned and made his way back upstairs. He did not return to the sitting room. Instead, he climbed to the second floor, to the bedroom he shared with Holmes, or would share with Holmes when Holmes was there, which was increasingly rare as Holmes's investigations took on a more exotic character. The bedroom was cold. The window stood open, or rather, as open as it could stand while still appearing closed from the street below, the particular ventilation that Holmes preferred, the one that allowed him to come and go without using the front door or the stairs, or any of the conventional means that ordinary people employed. On the desk sat a letter, written in handwriting that was not quite Holmes's own careful script, but which had been written to Holmes's satisfaction. The envelope bore no address. Inside, on a single sheet of paper, in ink that had not yet fully dried, was written, "Vous have gone to attend to the Flemington matter. Will be back by dawn. If anything arrives while I am gone, do not open it. Do not comment on it. Simply observe. H." V was Holmes's code for Watson. He used it only when he wished Watson to understand that he had anticipated something, that the wheels had been set in motion before the question was even asked. Watson had learned, over their years together, not to resent this. It was simply the way Holmes moved through the world, always 3 steps ahead, always listening for the sound of destiny before destiny had quite finished making up its mind. Holmes was a man who heard things others could not hear, who saw patterns in the chaos that ordinary people mistook for randomness. He was, in many ways, impossible to live with. And yet Watson had lived with him for nearly 20 years. The instruction was clear. Do not open it, do not comment on it. Simply observe. Watson carried the tin back to his room and set it on the windowsill where the frost had begun to trace patterns in the condensation. The symbols caught the first grey light of the approaching dawn, which was beginning imperceptibly to transform the blackness into something slightly less absolute. He sat on the edge of his bed and contemplated the tin, turning it occasionally to see how the light changed it, how the shadows moved across those mysterious symbols. A woman, he thought. Almost certainly a woman. The size of the footprint he had not seen but could imagine, from the sound of the step, the deliberation of the movement, the fear underneath it all. Yes, a woman. Someone young, perhaps. Someone who had worked carefully to accomplish this delivery. Someone for whom this moment had taken considerable courage. And Holmes had known. Holmes had anticipated this, had known that something would arrive, had left explicit instructions to observe it. This was either a case Holmes had accepted before Watson knew it, or it was something Holmes had foreseen through methods that Watson had long since stopped trying to understand. There was no point in trying to logic one's way through a Holmes deduction. Better to simply wait and see how the pieces arranged themselves. He did not go back to sleep. He sat by the window and watched the city wake. The frost began to ease as the sun, which Watson never saw, hidden as it was behind London's grey wool of cloud, began its ascent above the eastern rooftops. The symbols on the tin became less clear as the direct light faded, replaced by the general illumination of a London morning in winter. Somewhere below, the city began to move. The milk cart came past. The newspaper seller called out the day's headlines. A maid swept the steps of a house across the street. The ordinary machinery of the day began to turn. Watson held the tin in his hands and waited for meaning to emerge from the mystery. Mrs. Hudson found them both in the sitting room when she came up with the morning tea, though under very different circumstances than she was accustomed to. Holmes had returned some time in the dark. Watson had not heard it, which meant it had been deliberate, calculated to avoid disturbing the household, and was now standing by the window with the tin in his hands, turning it with the same methodical care Watson had applied to it 6 hours earlier. He had not yet opened it. He had not yet commented on it. He was simply observing, rotating it in his long fingers, tilting it to catch the weak December light. He was still wearing his coat from the night before. His hair showed the moisture of London fog, not rain, but that particular mist that settles on you when you've been walking through the streets in the dark hours. His face was drawn in that particular way it became when Holmes had been awake too long, when the sharp edges of his intelligence had been honed so fine they began to cut against the ordinariness of the world around him. Mrs. Hudson set down the tea with a sharp clink that suggested her disapproval of the hour, the season, and life in general. She did not comment on the tin. She did not ask questions. But her eyes tracked Holmes's movements with the precision of a woman who had been managing Holmes for long enough to know that when he was in this state of focused, almost dreamlike concentration, it was best to leave food and hot water and to stay out of his way. "I don't know what you've been up to," Mrs. Hudson said to no one in particular, addressing instead the breakfast things and the fire that needed tending. "But there's been someone in and out of this house in the dead hours. Heard it myself twice, and made the decision not to interfere. I am not a woman who interferes in the business of this household, though Lord knows I have cause to be." She gathered the previous night's cold cups with more force than strictly necessary, rattling them together in a way that managed to communicate both disapproval and concern in equal measure. "Mrs. Hudson," Holmes said gently without turning from the window, "I owe you my thanks. Profound thanks. Your discretion in this matter is precisely what was required." She softened at that. She always did, though Watson suspected she did not like to admit it even to herself. Holmes had a way of disarming people with a single sentence of genuine gratitude. It was perhaps the only truly deceptive thing about him, because the gratitude was real, but the sentiment underneath it was incalculable. Holmes thanked people not out of habit or politeness, but out of a clear-eyed recognition of the value of what they had done. It was a rare thing to be thanked by Holmes, and it was worth something. "Will I be needing to call the police, sir?" Mrs. Hudson asked, straightening her apron. "Decidedly not." "Will there be trouble?" "No trouble, Mrs. Hudson. Quite the opposite, I think. A small matter that required very little of me, and now requires even less. You may rest assured that the household is in no danger. What has occurred here is, in fact, a very good thing. Or it will be, once we understand what it means." She was not reassured by this answer, but she was satisfied, which was close enough for her purposes. She withdrew, but not before pausing at the door to glance at the tin with the expression of a woman who knew that tin had come into her house bearing secrets, and that those secrets would not be shared with her, and that this state of affairs was somehow fitting in a building where secrets were the only constant. Watson poured the tea. 2 cups, one for himself, one for Holmes, though Holmes would not drink it. They had been together long enough that this ritual had become almost ceremonial. Watson pouring. Holmes accepting the cup without actually consuming the contents, the act itself being what mattered. The gesture, the acknowledgement of companionship that did not require the interruption of food or drink. "You were expecting this," Watson said. It was not a question. "A variant of this," Holmes said, finally turning from the window. His eyes were very bright, the pupils dilated in that way they became when he had been awake for too long, or when he had taken one of his chemical expeditions. Watson hoped it was merely exhaustion. "I did not know it would be gingerbread. I did not know the specifics of the cipher, but I knew that something would arrive. I knew that someone would come to this house in the dark carrying gratitude that was too fragile to express in daylight. Then this is a case you have accepted." "Not accepted precisely. It is a case that accepted me, several months ago, without my formal agreement to it. There is a distinction. When someone comes to this house and tells me they have a problem, I accept or decline with full knowledge of what I am undertaking, but sometimes, Watson, a person speaks to you, just speaks in passing, with no intention of making a request, and in speaking, they give you a kind of obligation, not a legal one, not a contractual one, but a moral one, a human one. Holmes set down the tin and picked up his tea, holding it but not drinking. Steam rose from the cup, disappearing into the cold air of the sitting room. Outside, the light was beginning to strengthen. It was approaching 8 o'clock. The household was waking. The day was beginning in earnest. "You have not opened it," Watson observed. "No, and neither have you, which speaks to something I have always known about you, a peculiar kind of restraint, a respect for the mysterious as a category. Not everyone possesses it. Most people, faced with a mysterious package in the small hours, open it immediately. They cannot resist. The desire to know overwhelms every other consideration. You did not. That tells me something about your character, something that has perhaps been true all along, but which I have never adequately appreciated." Watson did not know what to say to this, so he drank his tea instead, which was still hot and attended to the fire. The coals had burned down during the night, and he added more fuel carefully, watching the new coal catch and begin to smoulder. Outside, the sounds of London were increasing. The milk cart, the newspaper seller, the sound of feet on wet pavement. The city was waking. "The symbols," Watson said, "you can read them. I can hazard a guess. But the hazarding of guesses is the recourse of amateurs, and I left off being an amateur approximately 30 years ago. Let us think instead about what they mean. What would compel a person to come to this house in the dark, to ascend a staircase in absolute blackness, which she must have done, for there is dried mud on the threshold that corresponds to neither your boots nor mine, and it bears the mark of a shoe approximately 5 sizes smaller than my own, and to leave this object with symbols traced in icing. A message," Watson said, "a message that could not be left by day, could not be written or spoken, could not be delivered by the ordinary post. Why not?" Watson considered. The question was the sort that Holmes asked when he already knew the answer, but wanted Watson to arrive at it through his own reasoning. Because someone is watching her, or she fears they are, or— and here Watson hesitated, because the third option required a different kind of thinking. Or she wishes the message to appear anonymous. She wishes you to know that she is grateful, but she does not wish you to know who she is. Not yet, anyway. "The last is most likely, I think," Holmes said, and there was something in his voice that suggested warmth, approval even. "If someone were watching her, she would not come here at all. The risk would be too great. And if she feared they were watching her, she would not have come twice." "Twice?" Watson looked up from his tea. "Did you not hear her the first time? I assume you were awake. The footstep pattern was identical, the same careful placement of weight, the same slight hesitation on the third step, the same duration of presence outside the door. She came once to gather her courage, placed her hand on the doormat and left. Then, after several hours of deliberation, I should estimate 4 hours based on the warmth remaining in the tin and the state of crystallization on the icing, she gathered whatever final reserves of courage remained and came again. This time she left the tin." Watson did not remember the first instance. Perhaps he had been dozing. Perhaps his mind had simply not registered what had happened. The mind played such tricks in the hours before dawn, collapsing one moment into another, losing the thread of what was heard and what was dreamed. It was humbling, actually, to realize that he had missed half of the night's events, while Holmes, somewhere out in the city, had apparently known exactly what was going to happen. "You mean to leave it unopened?" Holmes said. It was not a question. He was stating a fact, reading Watson's intention from his posture, his expression, the unspoken language of a man who had known Watson for nearly 2 decades. "Is that not what you intended?" "It is exactly what I intended. We will observe it today as Christmas resolves itself around us. We will not open it. We will wait." "For what?" Holmes smiled then, a rare thing and rarely genuine, but genuine now, a smile that suggested he had just remembered something pleasant, or had just understood something about the world that pleased him. "For the gingerbread, Watson, to speak for itself. Everything speaks given time. This tin will be no exception. Everything that enters this house carries a story. The tin will eventually tell us what its story is. We need only be patient." But patience, Watson would discover, was a difficult commodity to maintain. The morning progressed in its ordinary fashion. Mrs. Hudson brought breakfast, which Holmes did not eat, pushing the plate away after a single contemplative look at it. Watson ate for both of them, as he had learned to do over the years. Holmes took to pacing, which was his way of thinking, moving back and forth across the sitting room like a man on a ship, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes focused on something very far away. The morning post arrived around 10 o'clock. Bills mostly. The occasional letter from someone seeking Holmes's assistance. A Christmas card from Lestrade, carefully impersonal, the sort of thing that was sent because social convention required it rather than because any genuine sentiment accompanied it. Nothing of immediate interest, though Holmes glanced through each piece with his usual precision, reading the postmarks, noting the quality of the paper, drawing conclusions that Watson had long since stopped attempting to predict. Around 10:30, Holmes stopped his pacing and turned to face Watson with sudden focus. "I should like to go out, Watson. There is someone I wish to speak with." "At this hour, on Christmas Eve?" Watson glanced toward the window where the day outside was grey and cold, the kind of day that discouraged unnecessary travel. Especially at this hour, especially on Christmas Eve. People are at their most honest on Christmas Eve, Watson. They have dropped their defences. The holiday has a way of softening even the most hardened resolve. They are willing to say things, to admit things, to acknowledge truths that they would ordinarily conceal beneath layers of social propriety and self-protection. I should very much like to speak with someone who is caught in that state, vulnerable, honest, perhaps a little afraid. It is when people are most honest that one can learn the most about them. Then you have identified the person who left the tin. I have identified a possibility, a probability perhaps. But identification and proof are different things, Watson. I think before this day is out, we shall require proof. Holmes began to dress for the outdoors. Coat, hat, gloves, the whole ritual of preparing oneself for London's evening. The ritual was always the same, performed with the precision of someone for whom such preparations were not mere habit, but essential ceremony. Each item was retrieved, considered, and arranged with care. "Where are you going?" Watson asked. "To the Marylebone Road. There is a small shop there, a florist's establishment. I believe we shall find it instructive. But I shall go alone, Watson. You remain here. You observe the tin, you observe the day, you note any changes, any shifts in the light, any variation in the room's mood. I know this sounds fanciful to you, but there is an information in simply being present in a place, in allowing oneself to absorb its atmosphere. You are better at this than you realise. When will you return?" "By evening, I think, before dinner. But if I am delayed, do not concern yourself. I am quite capable of managing the city on my own, and there is no particular danger in what I undertake this afternoon." And so Holmes left, descending the stairs with the particular energy that suggested he had already begun his work, already begun to arrange the pieces of whatever puzzle occupied him. Watson heard the front door close. He returned to the sitting room and took his customary chair by the fire. The tin sat on the occasional table, unchanged. But something in the room had altered with Holmes's departure. The space felt different. Not empty. Mrs. Hudson moved quietly through the house below, attending to her ordinary tasks, but emptier. Holmes had a way of filling a room with his presence, of making whatever space he occupied feel significant and charged with potential. Without him, the room fell back to its ordinary state. A room, a fire, an old doctor with nothing to do but observe. Watson picked up the tin and examined the symbols again. A circle, a dash, a cross, a circle, a longer dash, a star-broken heart. And then the pattern repeated, 3 times across the surface of the tin, each time slightly smaller, as if the creator had been practicing working toward perfection. 7 symbols repeated 3 times, 21 letters of a message if one could call them that. He had studied ciphers in a casual way during his time in India. Nothing serious. Nothing that would have qualified him as an expert, but enough to know that symbols could represent letters, or numbers, or concepts. Enough to understand that someone had taken considerable time to develop this particular system. It was too elaborate to be accidental, too careful to be anything but deliberate. The gingerbread itself smelled warm and spiced. Cinnamon, Watson thought. Clove. The spices of Christmas, the spices of memory. Someone had made this with considerable skill, had invested time and care in its creation. Not a rushed confection, not something prepared hastily. This was the work of someone who had planned, who had prepared, who had thought through every detail. The symbols on top caught the firelight, throwing small shadows. A circle, a dash, a cross, a circle, a longer dash, a star-broken heart, and then again, and then again. Watson settled back in his chair and waited for evening to come. The day moved slowly around him, and the tin sat on the table, keeping its secrets, and somewhere out in the city, Holmes was speaking with someone, learning something, drawing conclusions that would only make sense later, when all the pieces had been arranged. The fire burned, the clock ticked, and outside London moved toward Christmas, carrying its mysteries, keeping its counsel, waiting for the moment when everything would become clear. The afternoon was the sort that exists only in London in December, grey and soft and somehow both entirely empty and completely full at the same time. The kind of afternoon where the light never really seems to establish itself, where noon and evening are separated by a difference of impression rather than actual luminosity. Watson sat by the fire and told himself that he would remain at Baker Street. He would observe the tin as Holmes had instructed. He would wait for Holmes to return with whatever information he had gathered from the florist's shop, for it was clearly the florist's shop that Holmes sought. Watson had recognised the mention of Marylebone Road immediately, but patience, Watson was discovering, was a difficult thing to maintain when one's mind was actively engaged in a mystery. It was one thing to be told to wait. It was another thing entirely to sit still, while questions accumulated in one's mind like snow on a winter afternoon. By 2:30, Watson had read the same paragraph of his newspaper 4 times without absorbing a single word. By 3 o'clock he had abandoned the pretence of reading entirely and had taken to pacing, the same pacing that Holmes engaged in, though Watson suspected his own pacing was less productive, being motivated by restlessness rather than by any particular train of thought. By 3:45 he had made a decision that he knew Holmes would have anticipated and probably approved of, even if he would not have admitted to approving of it. He would go to Marylebone Road himself. There was no particular logic to this decision. Watson could have remained at 221B Baker Street. He could have continued to observe the tin, as Holmes had instructed. The instructions had been clear: observe, but do not open. They had said nothing about departing the premises, and besides, Watson reasoned to himself as he retrieved his coat and hat, he was not going to interfere with Holmes's investigation. He was simply going to observe the florist's shop to gather his own impressions, to be present in the place that had for some reason captured Holmes's attention. It was what Watson did. He was the observer, the recorder, the chronicler of Holmes's deductions. The afternoon was cold, the kind of cold that took hold of one's breath and made it visible. Small clouds of white that dissipated into the grey air. The streets of London were thick with Christmas shoppers, people moving with the particular urgency of those who had left their shopping until the last possible moment and who were now engaged in a frantic scramble to acquire gifts, decorations, and the various necessities that the season demanded. The pavements were crowded. The shop windows were bright. Gas lamps had been lit despite the hour, creating pools of golden light that seemed to float on the grey afternoon like small promises of warmth. The florist's shop was not difficult to find. There was only one on Marylebone Road that could have been the one Holmes meant to visit. It occupied the ground floor of a narrow building wedged between a draper's shop and a house that let rooms. The shop front was modest, not grand, not the sort of establishment that catered to the wealthy or the fashionable. Instead, it was the kind of place that served the neighbourhood, that existed in the quiet spaces between the grander establishments, that was known to the people who lived nearby and largely invisible to everyone else. The window held an arrangement of holly and pale roses, winter's compromise with colour. There was no excessive decoration, no attempt at grand display, simply flowers, arranged with what Watson recognised as considerable skill, each stem placed with deliberation, each bloom positioned to catch the light in a particular way. It was the work of someone who understood flowers not as commercial products, but as living things deserving of respect. Watson stood outside the shop for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He was not Holmes. He did not have Holmes's capacity to walk into a situation and immediately identify the crucial details, the small telltale signs that would reveal everything. But he had learned, over the years, to observe, to notice, to listen to what was said and, more importantly, to what was left unsaid. He opened the door. The interior of the florist's shop was warm and close, the warmth coming from a small stove at the back, the closeness coming from the profusion of plants and flowers that occupied every available surface. The scent was overwhelming at first. green and living and rich with the particular smell of soil and water and growing things. It was a smell that seemed to bring the country into the city, that suggested spring even in the depths of winter. A young woman was working at a bench near the back of the shop, tidying the workspace, removing the remnants of the day's arrangements. She looked up when the door opened. There was a small bell that chimed, gentle and clear, and Watson saw in that moment before she schooled her expression something that looked very much like fear. She was perhaps 25 years old, though she had the quality of someone who had lived a more compressed life than her years might suggest. Her hair was dark, pulled back from her face with a kind of practical severity that suggested she wore it this way not for fashion but for function. Her hands were stained with the residue of her work, soil under the fingernails, the faint green stains that come from handling plants, the marks of dye from ribbon. She wore a simple dress, dark wool, the kind of dress that was chosen for utility rather than appearance. But it was her eyes that struck Watson most forcefully. They were frightened eyes, watchful eyes, the eyes of someone who had learned to read faces, to anticipate reactions, to prepare for disappointment or judgment. "Good afternoon," Watson said, employing the voice and manner that he knew put people at ease, warm, casual, unthreatening. "I find myself in need of flowers. My landlady—" And here he was deliberately vague, not wishing to mention 221B Baker Street, or Mrs. Hudson by name, has expressed a desire for something cheerful. Christmas flowers, I suppose one might say. I find myself rather at a loss as to what would be appropriate. The young woman visibly relaxed. It was a small shift. Her shoulders lowered slightly, her hands unclenched. The fear did not disappear entirely, but it retreated, became something more manageable. "We have holly," she said, gesturing toward a bucket in the corner, "and Christmas roses, and pale roses, which look well with evergreen. We also have some white chrysanthemums, which are quite striking in a winter arrangement." "You have excellent taste," Watson said, moving into the shop properly now, allowing his eyes to wander across the various arrangements, the hanging plants, the vases and scissors and spools of ribbon. "I can see that from the window display. That arrangement of roses and holly, that was your work, I take it?" "Yes." She seemed pleased by the observation, and the pleasure seemed to relax her further. "I arranged the window weekly. My father taught me before he passed. He believed that the window was the shop's face, the thing that greeted people before they even entered." "He taught you well? The arrangement is extraordinary. There is a kind of—" and Watson searched for the right word. "A kind of intentionality to it. Each flower placed with thought." The young woman smiled then, a small smile, tentative, but genuine. "That is kind of you to say. Most people do not notice such things. They simply want flowers. They do not think about how they have been arranged, or why one placement might be preferable to another." "I suspect you think about it considerably," Watson said. He was beginning to understand why Holmes had directed him to this place, or rather, why Holmes had come himself. There was something deeply honest about this young woman, something that suggested she would find it difficult to hide anything if questioned directly. But she was also clearly afraid of something, or someone. "I do," she admitted. "I think about it when I should perhaps be thinking about customers, or money, or the ordinary business of keeping the shop open. My mother says that I waste time thinking about flowers when I should be thinking about profit." "Your mother is the one who mentioned the desire for flowers." "No, And here she paused, and Watson saw the fear flicker back across her face for just a moment. "That is, I assumed you were speaking of your landlady." "I am," Watson said quickly, seeking to settle her fear. "Simply making conversation. Is your mother involved in the shop as well?" "She manages the accounts, and the ordering. I arrange the flowers and attend to customers mostly. It is. We share the space, but we do not always share the vision for the space." Watson was beginning to construct a picture. A young woman, talented, conscientious, living under the management of a mother who did not share her values. A woman whose time and energy were devoted to creating beauty, but who was frustrated in that devotion by practical concerns and parental authority. A woman who might, under certain circumstances, find it necessary to communicate things that could not be said aloud during the day in the presence of authority. "I should like a selection," Watson said, moving toward the bucket of white chrysanthemums. "These, I think, and some of the roses from the window, if they can be spared, and a quantity of the evergreen, something that will last through Christmas and into the new year." The young woman's face changed when he asked for items from the window display. It was a subtle change, but it was there. A kind of surprise, as if this particular request held significance beyond its literal meaning. "The window display," she said. "Are you certain? It is quite elaborate. It might be wasted on a simple arrangement." "I think," Watson said carefully, "that an arrangement as fine as that one deserves to be enjoyed, not simply looked at from the street. I should be honoured to take it to my home. Would that be possible?" She was quiet for a long moment, and in that moment Watson understood that he had said something significant, that he had somehow unknowingly spoken a kind of truth that this young woman had been needing to hear. "Yes," she said quietly. "Yes, I can arrange that. I can arrange the flowers and have them for you by evening. Or," and here she hesitated, and Watson saw in her hesitation something that resembled a decision being made, "or you could return tomorrow on Christmas Eve. I am open in the morning, and I could have something even more beautiful prepared by then." "Christmas Eve would be perfect," Watson said, "though I confess I did not catch your name." "Eleanor," she said. "Eleanor Hartwell. This is my shop, though the law required considerable complication to make it so when I inherited it from my father. I am known as Nellie, mostly by those who know me." "Nellie," Watson repeated, fixing the name in his mind. "A pleasure, Miss Hartwell. I shall return on Christmas Eve morning." Watson departed the shop as the afternoon was beginning its final descent toward evening. The grey light had taken on a slightly warmer cast, a hint of rose and amber touching the clouds from underneath. The street lamps were being lit. Watson could hear the lamplighter moving along the pavement with his long pole, igniting each lamp in sequence, creating pools of light that pushed back the encroaching darkness. He walked slowly back toward Baker Street, his mind occupied with what he had learned, which, strictly speaking, was very little concrete information. But there had been a quality to the exchange that suggested a great deal. Eleanor Hartwell was afraid of something. She lived under the authority of a mother who did not appreciate her talents. She had been moved by his compliment to the window display, moved in a way that suggested no one had complimented her on such things before, and she had chosen to delay their transaction until Christmas Eve, which suggested that she had something in mind, something that she wanted to prepare. By the time Watson reached Baker Street, the evening had established itself completely. The fog had come in, not the thick fog of deep winter, but a lighter fog, something that hung in the air like smoke, that caught the light of the gas lamps and held it, suspended in the grey air. The street was quieter now. The day's hurried commerce had slowed. People were at home, gathered around fires, preparing for the evening meal. The city had begun to settle. Holmes had not yet returned. Watson retrieved the key from his pocket and let himself into the house. Mrs. Hudson called out from somewhere below, but Watson did not stop to speak with her. Instead, he climbed the stairs to the sitting room, where the fire still burned, and where the tin still sat on the occasional table, unchanged, eternal, waiting. Watson settled into his chair and picked up the tin, turning it again in his hands. The symbols caught the firelight: a circle, a dash, a cross, a circle, a longer dash, a star-broken heart, repeated 3 times, 7 symbols multiplied 3 times, 21 letters that spelled out something, that meant something, that were waiting to be decoded. He was beginning to understand what kind of message it might be. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked quietly, marking time. Watson sat with the tin in his hands and waited for Holmes to return. The fire burned. The fog pressed against the windows, and somewhere out in the city Holmes was moving through the streets, gathering information, arranging facts into patterns, drawing conclusions that would, when revealed, make perfect sense and seem obvious in retrospect. It was a few minutes past 7 when Holmes returned. He came quietly as he always did, moving up the stairs with the kind of silence that suggested he had learned, long ago, to move through the world without announcing his presence. He was still wearing his coat, still carrying the moisture of the fog on his hair and shoulders. "You have been to the shop," Holmes said immediately, without preamble, without even the courtesy of a greeting. Watson set down the tin. "Yes, I observed, as you instructed, but my patience proved limited. I thought to gather my own impressions. And what did you conclude? That the person who left the tin is a young woman named Eleanor Hartwell, who manages a florist's shop on Marylebone Road. That she is talented but undervalued. That she lives under the authority of her mother, who does not share her aesthetic vision. That she was moved when I complimented her work, and that she has, I believe, something in mind for Christmas Eve. Holmes's face showed something then, a kind of satisfaction perhaps, or approval. You are learning, Watson. You may not have Holmes's methods, but you have developed an ear for what matters. Eleanor Hartwell, yes. A young woman of considerable talent and very little agency. A young woman who has learned to communicate through flowers rather than words, because words have not been permitted to her. A young woman whose kindness has been noted, and whose kindness has, I believe, prompted this particular delivery. Then you have already spoken with her? Briefly. I did not reveal myself, but I asked questions that allowed her to speak about her father, and about her work, and about the restraints placed upon her by her mother. And in speaking about those things, she revealed considerably more than she perhaps intended. But the story is not yet complete, Watson. The final piece has not yet been revealed. We must wait for Christmas Eve. We must wait to see what she has prepared. Only then will we understand the full significance of this cipher and the gratitude it is meant to convey. The story of Eleanor Hartwell, though Eleanor would never have called it her own story, having learned long ago to think of herself as a minor character in other people's narratives, began not with her, but with her brother. His name was Thomas, and he was 3 years her junior, though he had always possessed the quality of being older than her in spirit, or at least in his capacity for disappointment. When their father died 6 years earlier, the florist's shop had passed to Eleanor. This was unusual enough to require legal intervention, and a kind of grinding, bureaucratic process that had taken months and considerable expense. Women did not inherit businesses. Women did not run establishments in London. And yet Eleanor's father had left a will that was explicit on this point. The shop was to go to Eleanor, not to his brother, Eleanor's Uncle Harold, who had been managing it for decades and who had expected, with the kind of comfortable certainty that comes from a lifetime of habit, to simply acquire the property as a matter of course. Uncle Harold had been disappointed. He had also been practical. Rather than fight Eleanor's inheritance, which would have been expensive and uncertain, he had accepted her ownership and simply continued to work there, maintaining the stocks, managing the physical labour, leaving Eleanor to handle the arrangement and the customers. It was an arrangement that had worked reasonably well until Uncle Harold had himself died 2 years ago, at which point the shop had become truly Eleanor's, with no buffer between her and the full weight of its responsibilities. Her mother had moved into the household shortly after her father's death. This had seemed, at the time, like a practical solution. Her mother needed somewhere to live. Eleanor needed someone to manage the accounts and the ordering. It had seemed, in the way that many terrible arrangements seem in their beginning, like a reasonable compromise. It had not been reasonable. Eleanor's mother, whose name was Margaret, and who had cultivated a talent for disappointment that rivaled her son's, did not understand flowers. She understood money. She understood profit margins and overhead costs and the value of efficiency. She did not understand why Eleanor spent hours arranging a single window display, when that same time could be spent arranging cheaper bouquets for sale. She did not understand why Eleanor insisted on using the finest ribbons, on selecting flowers for their aesthetic qualities rather than their commercial value. She certainly did not understand why Eleanor had, several years ago, taken money from the shop's accounts. Eleanor had taken the money for her brother. This was the shame that she carried with her, the thing that she could not speak about, the thing that had come to define her inner life. Thomas had come to London when he was 20 years old, full of plans and energy, and the kind of optimism that only exists in people who have not yet learned that the world is not particularly interested in their plans. He had expected to find work easily. He had expected that his education, which was respectable if not exceptional, would be sufficient to secure employment. He had expected a great deal of things that London had systematically disproven. By the time Eleanor heard about his situation, he had been in the city for 3 months with no employment and no prospects. He had exhausted his savings. He was living in a room in Suffolk, eating irregularly, beginning to develop that particular quality of desperation that comes when a person realizes that no one is going to save them, that salvation, if it comes at all, must come from within themselves or from some unexpected source. He had not written to their mother about his situation. Their mother would have offered nothing but judgment and the observation that he was weak, that he lacked the necessary fortitude for city life, that he deserved his circumstances. Eleanor had discovered his situation by accident. A letter from a mutual acquaintance, meant to be cheerful, but which had contained enough between the lines to make Eleanor understand that her brother was in serious trouble. She had gone to see him without telling her mother. She had seen the room he lived in, the thinness of his coat, the way his hands shook when he attempted to smile at her. And she had done what she had always done. She had attempted to fix things. She had taken money from the shop. Not a great amount, she was too careful, too afraid of discovery, too acutely aware of what it would mean to her mother if the accounts did not balance. But enough. £3 over the course of a month. £3 stolen from the florist's shop, taken in small increments, removed from the account in ways that she hoped would be lost in the ordinary fluctuations of business. She had given the money to Thomas and told him to use it to find better lodging, to present himself better, to give himself a chance at employment. He had used the money exactly as she had instructed. He had secured a better room. He had purchased a new shirt. He had managed within 3 months to secure employment as a clerk in a law office in the city. He had eventually moved to Bristol, where he had taken a position in a larger firm and where he had begun to build something like a life. He had never repaid Eleanor the £3. He had never asked her where the money had come from, and Eleanor had never told him. But she had known. She had carried the knowledge with her like a weight, like a stone in her chest. She was a thief. She had stolen from the shop that was legally hers, but which she felt in some deep and irrational way that she did not deserve. She had committed a crime in order to help someone else, and that crime had never been discovered, and that fact made it worse somehow, made it feel more real, more damning. Discovery would have been a kind of absolution. Instead, there was only the continuous knowledge of what she had done, the continuous belief that she was not deserving of good things. It was in September that a man had come into the shop and asked for white roses. He was a gentleman, or at least he dressed as one. He moved through the world with a kind of careful precision that suggested he had learned, at some point, to measure his impact on his surroundings. He had paid double what the roses were worth without quibbling, without the kind of negotiation that most customers engaged in. He had come several times after that, each time requesting white roses, each time paying more than was asked. The 4th time he had come, he had seemed troubled, upset about something. And when Eleanor had commented on his obvious distress, he had asked her a question that had changed something fundamental in how she thought about herself. He had asked her if she had ever done something that she was ashamed of, something small, something that no one would ever know about, but something that made her feel like she was not deserving of good things, and she had told him. She had stood in her flower shop surrounded by the things that brought her joy, and she had confessed to a stranger that she had stolen from the business she owned, that she had taken money to help her brother, and that she had been carrying the guilt of it as if it were a capital crime. He had listened without judgment. He had simply sat in the back room of the flower shop and had listened while she told him everything, about her father, about her mother, about Thomas, about the £3 that had somehow become, in her mind, the thing that defined her moral character. And when she had finished, when she had said all the things that she could not say to anyone else, he had spoken. He had told her that what she had done was not a theft, that theft required malice or greed, and that what she had done came from neither. He had told her that his entire life had been premised on the observation of human nature, and that the human nature that gave money to a brother in distress was not a human nature that deserved shame. He had said that she ought not to carry that burden. He had said it was too heavy, and she was too small, and he would not have it. And then he had left, and he had never come back. For months, Eleanor had not understood what had happened. She had been visited by a stranger, had confessed her deepest shame, and had been absolved by someone she did not even know. She had thought of him often, thought of his precise movements, his careful way of listening, his absolute certainty that she was not bad. She had thought of him so often that she had eventually, through the accident of recognition from a newspaper clipping, realized who he was: Sherlock Holmes, the consulting detective, a man who apparently spent his life solving mysteries and who apparently also spent his time, in passing, in flower shops, absolving young women of guilt they did not deserve to carry. When Watson had come into the shop on that grey afternoon, when he had complimented her window display with an attention that suggested he actually saw her work rather than simply looking at it, something had crystallised in Eleanor's mind. She had realised, with sudden clarity, that she wanted Holmes to know that he had mattered, that his few words, his simple declaration that she was not bad, had changed something in her, that she was still carrying it with her, even months later, even though she had tried not to, even though she knew it was foolish to be so moved by the kindness of a stranger. And so she had decided to bake. She had used her grandmother's recipe, her grandmother who had made gingerbread every Christmas, who had created something beautiful and spiced and warm. And she'd decided to encode a message in icing, to create a cipher that would require some effort to decode, because she did not want to give him words that were simple or easy. She wanted to give him something that required thought, something that was worthy of the thought he had given to her. The symbols had taken her hours to develop. She had worked late into the night, after her mother had gone to bed, sitting in the kitchen with paper and pencil, creating a simple system. A circle for 1, a dash for 2, a cross for 3. She had written out her message and then repeated it 3 times, in different arrangements across the top of the tin, hoping that the multiple renderings would make the pattern clearer. The message, encoded 3 times, read, "You saw me. I was not bad. Thank you." She had baked the gingerbread carefully, following every instruction her grandmother had left, letting the dough rest, allowing the spices to develop their full complexity. She had iced the symbols with hands that shook, and then she had stood in her room for hours, gathering the courage to deliver it. She had come to Baker Street once, at 2 in the morning, and had stood outside the door, unable to knock, unable to announce herself, afraid that if she revealed herself, Holmes would see that she was not worth the kindness he had shown her. She had stood there with the tin in her hands, her heart pounding, and then she had fled. But she had known, even then, that she would return, that she would find the courage somewhere. Because if Holmes had found the courage to show her kindness without expectation of return, perhaps she could find the courage to give him gratitude without expectation of acknowledgement, and so she had come back. Hours later, after the fear had subsided and been replaced by a kind of desperate determination, she had come back to Baker Street. She had placed the tin on the doormat. She had stood for just a moment outside the door, gathering all of herself into that moment, and then she had left it there. The gingerbread, the cipher, the message that said, "You saw me. I was not bad. Thank you." She did not know if he would understand. She did not know if he would care, but she'd sent it anyway, because the act of sending it mattered more than what came after. Because sometimes the only thing a person could do was to say thank you, and to hope that it would be received with the same grace that it had been offered. Holmes sat by the fire after his return, his long legs extended toward the warmth, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, in that posture of deep thought that Watson had come to recognise over the years. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence to settle between them, a silence that Watson had learned not to interrupt. When Holmes was ready to speak, he would speak. Until then, the silence itself was a form of communication. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 8 times. The fire crackled softly, the coal settling and shifting as the flames consumed it. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, muffling the sounds of the city, creating a kind of isolation that was almost peaceful. Watson sat in his chair, the tin still resting on the table beside him, and waited for Holmes to break the silence. It was several minutes before Holmes spoke. "You know," he said, his voice carrying that particular quality of weariness that came only after he'd been awake for extended periods and had engaged in the kind of intensive observation that characterized his work. "There is a misconception about detection. People believe that it is primarily concerned with the discovery of crime, with the identification of criminals, with the gathering of evidence that will stand up in court. They believe that a detective's work is fundamentally concerned with justice, with the application of law and order to a chaotic world." He paused, withdrew a hand from beneath his chin, and gestured absently toward the window. "But in fact," he continued, "detection, true detection, is concerned with understanding. It is concerned with seeing what is actually present rather than what we expect to see. It is concerned with listening to what people are saying, and more importantly, listening to what they are not saying. And sometimes, Watson, what one discovers through this process of careful observation is not a crime at all. Sometimes one discovers kindness. Sometimes one discovers beauty. Sometimes one discovers the simple fact that a human being is suffering in silence, and that the small gift of being listened to, of being seen, is enough to begin to heal that suffering. Watson did not respond immediately. He sensed that Holmes was not looking for confirmation or agreement. Instead, Holmes was working something out in his own mind, articulating something that he needed to articulate in order to make sense of it himself. Eleanor Hartwell came into my awareness approximately 3 months ago, Holmes continued. I had been engaged in an investigation that took me to the Marylebone Road, a matter of relatively minor importance, something involving a clerk and a discrepancy in accounts. The investigation led me to the florist's shop. I had no intention of entering the shop itself, but the afternoon was cold, and I found myself seeking shelter, and I noticed through the window an arrangement of flowers that suggested considerable skill. He was quiet for a moment, lost in the memory. I entered, he said. I purchased white roses, not because I required white roses, but because I wished to observe the proprietor while she worked, and I was struck immediately by the quality of her sadness. It was not the ordinary sadness that comes from disappointment or grief. It was something deeper. It was the sadness of a person who has come to believe through repeated evidence and circumstance that she is not deserving of good things, that she is fundamentally flawed in some way, that she carries within her a moral stain that will never be removed. Holmes rose from his chair and began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes focused on something very far away. I am not, as you know, a man who is inclined towards sentiment, he said. I do not typically concern myself with the emotional states of other people. But there is something about this particular variety of self-condemnation that catches my attention, because it is so often undeserved. A person believes themselves to be bad because they have done something that they believe to be wrong, and yet upon examination the thing they have done is often not wrong at all. It is in fact an expression of a fundamental human goodness, and yet they carry the shame of it like a weight, like a stone, as if the very act of caring for someone else is somehow a mark against their moral character. Eleanor, Watson said quietly. Eleanor, Holmes confirmed. I returned to the shop several times over the following weeks. Each time I purchased white roses. Each time I observed her more carefully. And on the 4th visit I asked her a question. I asked her if she had ever done something that she was ashamed of. Something small, something that no one would ever know about, but something that made her feel like she was not deserving of good things. And she told you about the money, Watson said. She told me about the money. She told me about her brother. She told me about the years of carrying that guilt, of believing herself to be a thief, of thinking that she did not deserve happiness or success or love, because she had once stolen from the business that belonged to her in order to help someone else survive. And I listened to her, Watson, and I told her something that I do not often tell anyone. I told her that she was not bad, that what she had done was not a crime, that the human capacity to sacrifice for those we love is not a moral failing. It is the only thing that makes human life bearable. Holmes stopped his pacing and turned to face Watson directly. I did not expect it to matter, he said. I have found over my career that people are often incapable of accepting absolution, no matter how sincerely it is offered. They have become so accustomed to judging themselves that they cannot stop, even when someone else attempts to remove that burden from them. I offered Eleanor what forgiveness I could, knowing that it would likely be rejected, knowing that she would continue to carry her guilt, knowing that my words would probably be forgotten within weeks. But they were not forgotten, Watson observed. They were not forgotten, which suggests something about Eleanor that is both admirable and somewhat poignant. She has the capacity to receive kindness. She has the capacity to believe in the possibility of redemption, but she has also been living under the authority of a mother who has, throughout her life, communicated to her the message that she is not deserving of anything. And this gingerbread, Watson, this cipher traced in icing, this is Eleanor's attempt to tell me that she is still carrying what I said to her, that it has mattered, that it has changed something in how she thinks about herself. Holmes returned to his chair and picked up his tea, which had long since gone cold. He did not drink it. He simply held it, as if the cup itself contained meaning beyond its literal function. "There is a kind of cruelty in this," Holmes said quietly. "A cruelty that is entirely unintentional, and therefore more painful than any deliberate harm. Eleanor's mother does not beat her. She does not deprive her of food or shelter. She simply, day after day, communicates through her tone, through her priorities, through her complete lack of appreciation for Eleanor's talents and efforts, the message that Eleanor is not valuable, that her work does not matter, that her feelings do not count. And Eleanor has internalized this message so completely that she has built an entire moral framework around it, using a single act of kindness to her brother as proof of her own unworthiness. Will you tell her," Watson asked, "that you have forgiven her? That she need not carry this weight?" "I will tell her," Holmes said, "that she did the right thing. Not the legal thing, not the conventional thing, but the right thing. I will tell her that her brother would not have survived his time in London without her sacrifice, that the guilt she feels is a monument to her own goodness, not proof of her badness, and I will tell her that it is time for her to stop carrying it." He was quiet for a long moment. "But more importantly," he continued, "I will listen to her. I will create space for her to speak, to be seen, to have her experiences and her choices taken seriously. Because Eleanor has spent so long in a household where these things are not valued that she has forgotten that they matter. She has forgotten that her voice is worth hearing. And sometimes, Watson, the most radical act of kindness is simply to listen to someone, truly listen, and to treat what they say as if it matters. Because it does. What Eleanor thinks matters. What Eleanor feels matters. What Eleanor creates matters." Watson found himself moved by this speech, moved by the revelation of a side of Holmes that he did not often display. The logical, rational, coldly analytical Holmes was familiar to him. But this Holmes who was capable of seeing suffering and responding to it with genuine compassion, this was a Holmes that Watson had glimpsed only occasionally, and which, now that it was being displayed so openly, seemed both remarkable and deeply human. "Why did you not tell me?" Watson asked. "Why did you not explain the situation when you received the gingerbread? Why did you simply observe it and allow me to discover Eleanor for myself?" Holmes smiled, a small, genuine smile. "Because," he said, "I wanted you to see her, not through my eyes but through your own. I wanted you to form your own impression of her, to develop your own understanding of her situation, to arrive at your own conclusions about what kind of person she is. My understanding of Eleanor is coloured by my nature, by my tendency to observe and analyse and draw conclusions. But your understanding, Watson, is coloured by your capacity for empathy, by your ability to hear what is unsaid, by your fundamental goodness. And I thought that Eleanor would benefit from being seen by you, from being treated by you as a person who matters, as someone whose work and whose feelings deserve to be valued." "I did not know that I was doing anything significant," Watson said. "I simply offered her a compliment." "Exactly," Holmes said. "You offered her what she has never received from anyone who has any authority in her life. You offered her genuine recognition of her talent. You treated her work as if it was worth your time and attention. For Eleanor, that is a revolutionary act. That is kindness of a profound order." Holmes set down his cold tea and retrieved his pipe from the mantelpiece. He did not light it. He was considering, and the unlit pipe served as an aid to thought, but held it in his hands, turning it over and over, considering it from different angles. "The cipher," he said, "is quite simple once one understands the system. Eleanor has used numbers, disguised as symbols. A circle is 1, a dash is 2, a cross is 3, and so on. The message, repeated 3 times in different arrangements across the tin surface, reads, 'You saw me. I was not bad. Thank you.' It is a message of gratitude, and also a message of persistence. It is Eleanor telling me that she has not forgotten what I said, that it continues to matter to her, that it has changed something in how she moves through the world." "What will you do?" Watson asked. "Will you see her again?" "On Christmas Eve," Holmes said. "You will return to the florist's shop as you have promised to do. You will collect the arrangement that Eleanor has prepared for you. And in doing so, you will deliver to her a message that I shall prepare. A message that acknowledges her courage, that validates her choices, that tells her once again with the weight of certainty behind it that she is not bad, that she has never been bad, and that the world is better because she exists in it." He paused, and then added, with a quietness that suggested genuine feeling, "And perhaps, Watson, You will also tell her that there are people who see her, who value her, who believe that her work matters and that her kindness, expressed through flowers and through sacrifice, is a beautiful thing. Tell her that from me. Tell her that from yourself. She needs to hear it, and she needs to hear it from people who have no obligation to say it, who say it only because it is true. Watson found himself unable to speak. He had known Holmes for nearly 20 years, had recorded dozens of his cases, had observed him in his greatest moments of deduction. But he had never seen Holmes quite like this. Moved by something, invested in something beyond the intellectual puzzle of it all. It revealed a depth to Holmes that Watson had always suspected, but had never quite seen so clearly demonstrated. The gingerbread, Holmes said, returning to his consideration of the tin, is a gift, of course, but it is also a test. Eleanor has given us something to observe, something to decode, something to understand. She has asked us through this gift to prove that we are the kind of people who will take her seriously, who will value what she has done, who will see the significance in it. And through our response, through the way we treat this gift, through the way we return to her on Christmas Eve, through the way we acknowledge her courage, we will answer her question. We will tell her whether she is right to believe that she matters. He rose from his chair and retrieved the tin from the table. He held it up to the firelight, examining the symbols one final time. "It is quite beautiful, actually," he said softly. "The icing work is precise. The symbols are carefully rendered. The message is clear once one has the key. Eleanor has given us something that required considerable time and effort to create, and she has given it with no expectation of return, with no demand for acknowledgement. She has given it simply because she needed to express something, and this was the only way she could find to express it." He set the tin down with great care, as if it were made of something far more fragile than tin and gingerbread. "Watson," he said, "I want you to understand something. There are many kinds of mysteries in this world. Some of them are solvable through observation and logic. Some of them are solvable through careful attention to detail. But some of them, the deepest mysteries, the ones that matter most, can only be solved through kindness. Through the simple act of seeing someone, of valuing them, of communicating to them that their existence makes a difference. Eleanor's mystery was solved not by deduction but by human connection, and it will only remain solved if we continue to provide that connection." "Then we will," Watson said simply. "On Christmas Eve we will go to her. We will acknowledge what she has done. We will tell her that she matters, and perhaps in doing so, we will help her begin to believe it herself." Holmes nodded, satisfied. "Yes," he said. "I think that is exactly right. And now, Watson, if you would not mind, I think I shall attempt to sleep. I have been awake for approximately 36 hours, and my mind is beginning to approach the kind of exhaustion where even the most obvious facts become difficult to process. We will need our rest before Christmas Eve. We will need to be clear and present when we speak with Eleanor. She deserves our full attention." Watson watched as Holmes made his way upstairs, his coat still bearing the moisture of the fog, his hair still slightly damp but his eyes clear with the kind of satisfaction that came only when a mystery had been resolved not through violence or cunning, but through understanding and compassion. And on the occasional table the tin of gingerbread remained, waiting for the day when its message would be fully received, when Eleanor would know that she'd been seen, that she'd been heard, that she'd been forgiven, and that the kindness she feared she did not deserve had, in fact, been given to her without hesitation. Christmas Eve morning arrived with the kind of pale, cold light that suggested the sun was present somewhere above London, but had given up on making any real effort to illuminate the city. The frost had settled hard during the night, harder than it had been for weeks, and the windows of 221B Baker Street were decorated with ice crystals so intricate they looked like they had been designed by a craftsman, rather than formed by the random geometry of freezing water. Watson had slept poorly, his mind occupied with the events of the past days, with Eleanor and her gingerbread cipher, with Holmes's revelation of compassion hidden beneath layers of logic. He had woken before dawn and had made his way downstairs to find Holmes already dressed, already alert, already in that state of focused preparation that came before something that Holmes considered significant. "We will go at 9:30, Holmes said without preamble, as Watson was pouring his morning tea. "The florist's shop opens at 9, but we will allow Eleanor time to settle into her day, time to prepare herself." We do not wish to arrive too early, while she is still in that state of hurried activity that comes with opening the shop. We wish to arrive when she has had a moment to breathe, to centre herself. It will make what follows easier for her." "What exactly will follow?" Watson asked. "What do you intend to say to her?" "I intend," Holmes said carefully, "to tell her the truth. I intend to decode her cipher so that she knows I have understood her message. I intend to acknowledge the courage it took for her to create it, to deliver it, to place her gratitude in our hands. And I intend to tell her something that she desperately needs to hear, something that no one has told her, with the kind of certainty that only comes from outside her family, from someone with no obligation to her." "What is that?" Watson asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "That she matters," Holmes said simply. "That her life has value, that her work is beautiful, and that her kindness is recognized, and that she is deserving of the good things. That the guilt she carries is a monument to her own goodness, not proof of her badness." They departed 221B Baker Street at 25 minutes past 9. The morning was as cold as it had been the day before, but the fog had lifted slightly, allowing for better visibility. The streets were crowded with last-minute Christmas shoppers, people moving with the particular urgency of those who had left their shopping until the very last possible moment, and who were now engaged in a frantic scramble to acquire the final gifts, the last decorations, the essential items that the season demanded. The florist's shop was quiet when they arrived. Eleanor was in the back room, arranging something. Watson caught a glimpse of white flowers and deep green foliage, a composition that suggested considerable thought and care. When the small bell above the door chimed, she looked up, and Watson saw the moment of recognition dawn on her face, followed almost immediately by a kind of panic. "Dr. Watson," she said, setting down her scissors with careful precision. I did not expect you so early. I have not finished the arrangement. I was planning to have it ready by noon, and I thought—" "Eleanor," Holmes said, stepping into the shop fully, allowing the light to fall on his face in such a way that she could see him clearly. Eleanor stopped speaking. Her hands went very still. The colour drained from her face, then returned in a sudden rush. She gripped the edge of the workbench as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "You," she said. Her voice was barely audible. "You're—" "Sherlock Holmes," Holmes confirmed. "Yes. And I have come, on this Christmas Eve morning, to tell you something that I suspect you very much need to hear. But first, I wonder if you might offer us tea. What we have to discuss will take some time, and I find that tea makes these conversations considerably easier to navigate." Eleanor's hands were shaking. She looked from Holmes to Watson and back again, as if trying to convince herself that this was actually happening, that the man who had listened to her in September had actually returned, had actually come back to her shop on Christmas Eve morning. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steadier now. "Yes, of course. Please, come through to the back. My mother has gone to visit her sister for the morning. She will not return until this afternoon, so we can speak freely." She led them through to the back room, which was small and warm and filled with the smell of green things and flowers. A kettle was already heating on the small stove. Eleanor had clearly been planning to make tea for herself, and she busied herself with the ritual of preparing it, moving with the kind of careful precision that suggested she was using the activity to ground herself, to settle her nerves. When they were seated, when the tea had been poured and distributed, Holmes turned his full attention to Eleanor. It was the kind of attention that Watson had learned over the years to recognize as a form of intensity. When Holmes looked at someone like that, it was as if he was seeing every detail of them, every minute variation in expression, every shift in emotion. It was an attention that could be overwhelming, but which could also, in certain circumstances, be deeply validating. The gingerbread arrived at Baker Street on Christmas Eve morning, Holmes said, just after 4 o'clock. It was placed on the doormat by someone who had gathered considerable courage to make that delivery, someone who had baked the gingerbread carefully, following a recipe that held meaning for her, and who had iced the top with a cipher, a message rendered in symbols that required knowledge of a key to decode. Eleanor was watching him with an intensity that matched his own. She did not speak. She simply listened, as if afraid that any sound she made might break the spell of this moment. "The cipher reads," Holmes continued, "as follows. A circle is 1, a dash is 2, a cross is 3, A circle is 4. A longer dash is 5. The final symbol, the one you rendered as a star-broken heart, is 6. These 7 symbols, repeated 3 times in different arrangements across the tin surface, create the message, "You saw me. I was not bad. Thank you." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away. She did not break the eye contact. She simply allowed Holmes to continue. "I want you to understand something," Holmes said, and his voice had taken on a quality that Watson had never quite heard before, a quality of absolute sincerity, of speaking something that he believed deeply and profoundly. "I want you to understand that the message you sent was received not as a burden, not as an obligation, but as a gift. You gave me gingerbread, Eleanor. You gave me the work of your hands, the product of your care and skill and thought. And more than that, you told me that something I said, something I spoke in passing on a single September afternoon, had mattered enough to you to inspire this action. That is a profound thing. Do you understand that?" Eleanor began, then stopped. She set down her teacup with shaking hands. "I did not know if you would even remember me. I did not know if you would care. I only knew that I needed to tell you that what you said changed something in me." "I remember you," Holmes said. "I remember the moment you told me about your brother. I remember the exact tone of your voice when you described the guilt you had been carrying. And I remember making a decision in that moment that you needed to hear something that might counteract the years of being told through silence and inattention that you did not matter, that your feelings did not count, that your work was not valuable." He paused, and when he spoke again his voice was very quiet. "I want to tell you something now, Eleanor, and I want you to believe it with absolute certainty. You're not bad. You have never been bad. What you did for your brother, taking money from the shop, risking discovery, risking judgment, risking the loss of the only thing that truly belonged to you, that was not a crime. That was love. That was the highest expression of human goodness. You sacrificed for someone you cared about, and you have been punishing yourself for that sacrifice as if it were a capital crime. It is not. It is beautiful." Eleanor was crying openly now, her hands covering her face, her whole body shaking with the force of her sobs. But they were not sobs of despair. They were sobs of release, of something being finally acknowledged after years of carrying it in silence. Watson set down his tea and simply allowed the moment to exist. He had learned, over his years with Holmes, that sometimes the greatest gift one could offer was simply to be present, to witness, to not attempt to fix or repair or minimize what was happening. Eleanor needed to cry. Eleanor needed to allow herself to feel the relief of being truly seen, truly understood, truly accepted by someone whose judgment she valued. After several moments, Eleanor gathered herself. She retrieved a handkerchief from her pocket and wiped her eyes. She took a shaking breath. "My mother," she said, "has never approved of anything I do. She has never thought my work was valuable. She only sees the expense of flowers, the time wasted on arrangement, the profit that could be made if I would simply sell cheaper bouquets and be done with it. And I have begun to believe, over time, that she was right, that I was foolish to care about beauty, to care about how flowers were arranged, to care about anything beyond immediate profit and practicality." "Your mother," Holmes said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite anger, but close to it, "has communicated to you through consistent neglect and criticism that you're not valuable. That is a particular kind of cruelty, because it is often unintentional. Your mother may not realize what she is doing. She may believe, in fact, that she is helping you, teaching you to be practical, preparing you for a harsh world. But what she is actually doing is teaching you to hate yourself. And that is a lesson that takes considerable courage to unlearn." "How do I unlearn it?" Eleanor asked, her voice very small. "By listening," Holmes said, "when people tell you the truth about yourself, by recognizing that there are people in this world who see you, who value your work, who believe that what you do matters. Your flowers matter, Eleanor. The beauty you create matters, and the kindness you show, even when that kindness requires sacrifice, even when that kindness goes unnoticed, that matters most of all." He rose from his chair and moved to the workbench where Eleanor's unfinished arrangement sat. It was exquisite. White flowers, deep green foliage, carefully considered, clearly the work of someone who understood flowers not as commodities, but as living things worthy of respect. This, Holmes said, gesturing to the arrangement, is what you create when you're allowed to work without criticism, without the constant pressure to be practical, without the weight of someone else's judgment. This is what emerges when you're simply permitted to do what you love. Do you see how beautiful it is? Do you see how much skill, how much care, how much attention to detail is present in every stem, every leaf, every positioning? I see it, Eleanor said quietly. Then you must understand that this is not foolishness. This is not a waste of time. This is art. This is the creation of beauty in a world that desperately needs beauty. Your mother does not understand this, but that does not make it less true. Watson found himself deeply moved by this scene. He had known Holmes for nearly 2 decades, and he had seen Holmes in many moods, many states of mind. But he had never seen Holmes quite like this, moved by something beyond the intellectual puzzle of it, invested in something beyond the solving of a mystery. This was Holmes at his most fundamentally human, speaking not as a detective but as a person who understood suffering and who was attempting to alleviate it. Eleanor rose from her chair and moved to stand beside Holmes at the workbench. She looked at her own arrangement as if seeing it for the first time, as if understanding, through Holmes's words, that what she had created was valuable, was worthy of acknowledgement, was something that she could be proud of. "I was planning to give this to you," she said, looking at Watson. "I was preparing something beautiful, something that would say thank you to both of you for seeing me, for taking my work seriously. But now," and she paused, "now I understand that I was giving you not just flowers, but a piece of myself, that I was trusting you with something that I have never been permitted to be proud of. Then we will accept it," Holmes said, "with full understanding of what it represents. We will display it in the sitting room at Baker Street, and every time I see it, I will remember this moment. I will remember Eleanor Hartwell, who creates beauty in the midst of criticism, who sacrifices for those she loves without asking for acknowledgement, who has the courage to send Gingerbread Cipher to a stranger, because she needs to know that she matters. I will remember, and I will know that the world is better because you exist in it." Eleanor turned to face Holmes directly, and Watson saw in her eyes something that had not been there before, a kind of recognition of her own worth, a beginning of self-acceptance, a crack in the edifice of self-judgment that she had constructed over the years. "Will you come back?" she asked. "After Christmas? Will you visit the shop again?" "I will visit," Holmes said, "whenever I have need of white roses. And I suspect, Eleanor, that I will have need of white roses considerably more often than I have in the past." It was a small promise, but it was a genuine one. It was Holmes's way of saying that she mattered, that she would not be forgotten, that the connection between them had been established and would be maintained. Ellen moved to the stove and began to prepare more tea. Her hands were steadier now. Her movements were more assured. She was beginning, Watson thought, to settle into the knowledge that she had been truly seen, truly valued, truly accepted by people who had no obligation to her. "Tell me about your brother," Watson said, speaking for the first time since they had entered the shop. "Tell me about Thomas. I should like to know what became of him." Eleanor's face lit up. A genuine smile, the first truly unguarded smile Watson had seen from her. "He is in Bristol," she said. "He is a clerk in a law office, and he is doing well. He writes to me sometimes, though not as often as I would like. He has no idea where the money came from. I never told him. But he recovered from his time in London, and he built a life for himself. That is enough for me." "Does he know that you sacrificed for him?" Holmes asked. "No, and I do not think I will tell him. It would only make him feel guilty, and the guilt has already served its purpose. It has taught me something about myself. It has taught me that I am capable of giving, of caring, of putting someone else's needs before my own, and that is not a shameful thing." They remained in the florist's shop for the better part of an hour. Conversation flowed more easily now, though Watson noticed that Eleanor still spoke carefully, still seemed to be testing whether it was safe to express her true thoughts and feelings. But with each passing minute, she seemed to relax incrementally, to allow herself to be more fully present. When it came time to leave, Holmes retrieved the arrangement from the workbench and held it with great care. "This is beautiful work," he said to Eleanor. "You should be proud of it. And I mean that not as a polite observation, but as a statement of fact. This arrangement will sit in the sitting room at 221B Baker Street, and it will serve as a reminder of this morning, of this conversation, of the moment when you allowed yourself to be truly seen." Eleanor walked them to the door. As Watson was leaving, she reached out and took his hand. "Thank you," she said, "for coming to the shop, for complimenting my work, for seeing me." It made it easier somehow to believe that what I had done, sending the gingerbread, creating the cipher, was not foolish, that it was brave. "It was brave," Watson assured her. "It took considerable courage, and you should be proud of yourself for having that courage." Holmes paused at the door and turned back to face Eleanor one final time. "One more thing," he said. "The gingerbread. I want you to know that I will eat it. Not because I typically eat, but because this gingerbread is not food. It is a gift, a message, a piece of your care rendered in a form I can consume. I will eat it slowly, and I will think of you, and I will remember this moment. And I want you to know that whatever guilt you're carrying, whatever shame you have accumulated over the years, I am absolving you of it. I am officially, definitively, without reservation, telling you that you are not bad. You never were, and you never will be." The door closed softly behind them. Through the window, Watson could see Eleanor standing in the back of the shop, her hand resting on the workbench, her face transformed by something that looked very much like peace. The afternoon had passed in the way that Christmas Eves in London pass, slowly, deliberately, as if time itself was taking on the character of the day, becoming something more substantial, more significant. Holmes and Watson had returned to Baker Street with Eleanor's arrangement, which they had placed in the sitting room on a small table where it could catch the light. The white flowers seemed to glow against the deep green foliage, creating a kind of luminescence that made the entire corner of the room feel somehow more alive, more intentional. Mrs. Hudson had prepared a simple Christmas Eve dinner, nothing elaborate, nothing that required excessive explanation or justification. Simply food prepared with care, set out with the kind of quiet attention to detail that suggested she understood somehow that this Christmas was different, that something had shifted in the household, that the usual patterns of their existence had been interrupted by something that mattered. Holmes had not eaten much. Watson had observed this with the equanimity of long practice. When Holmes was engaged in thought, truly engaged, contemplating something beyond the merely intellectual, he often forgot the physical needs of the body. Food became irrelevant. Sleep became negotiable. The mind consumed itself in processing, arranging, understanding. By the time evening had settled fully over London, by the time the darkness had become complete and the fog had returned, softer and more forgiving than it had been in the morning, Holmes had still not opened the tin of gingerbread. Instead, it sat on the mantelpiece, positioned so that the firelight caught the icing symbols, making them visible, readable, communicative even in their silence. Watson sat in his chair by the fire, a book open on his lap, though he was not reading, and watched Holmes move about the sitting room with the kind of restless energy that came only when he was approaching a decision. Back and forth, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes focused on something very far away. At last, around 8 o'clock in the evening, Holmes stopped his pacing. He stood directly in front of the mantelpiece, looking at the tin as if it were a problem that required solving, a code that needed breaking, a mystery that demanded explication. "I think," he said quietly, "that the moment has come." Watson set down his book. "For what?" "For eating the gingerbread," Holmes said, "for consuming this gift that Eleanor has given us, for allowing the work of her hands to become a part of me, literally, physically, tangibly. This seems fitting, does it not? On Christmas Eve, surrounded by the warmth of the fire, in the presence of someone who understands the significance of what we have done today, this seems like the proper moment." He retrieved the tin from the mantelpiece with great care, as if it were made of something far more fragile than tin and gingerbread. He removed the brown paper wrapper, which crackled softly in the quiet of the room. The tin itself was revealed. Ordinary tin, the kind used for biscuits and confections, bearing no maker's mark. Nothing to suggest it was anything other than what it appeared to be. But it was not ordinary. They both understood that. It was the work of Eleanor's hands, the expression of Eleanor's gratitude, the cipher in which Eleanor had encoded her relief at being seen. Holmes opened the tin. The smell that emerged was extraordinary. Cinnamon and clove, ginger and nutmeg, the warm spices of Christmas rendered palpable, made into something that one could smell and recognize and remember. It was the smell of care, of time taken, of hands working carefully to create something that would bring pleasure. "It is beautiful," Watson said softly. "Yes," Holmes agreed. He retrieved a small piece of the gingerbread and held it up to the firelight, examining it. The colour was dark, rich, deeply brown, with the particular texture that comes only from gingerbread that has been allowed to age slightly, that has been given time for the spices to develop their full complexity. "It is beautiful, and it is also something else. It is evidence of Eleanor's faith in me. She has given me something that she created with her own hands, something that took considerable time and effort to make, something that she could have kept for herself or given to someone else. Instead, she gave it to me. Do you understand what that means, Watson?" "It means she trusts you," Watson said. "It means she trusts that I am the kind of person who will understand the significance of her gift. It means she believes that I will consume it thoughtfully, that I will appreciate it, that I will not treat it carelessly or dismiss it. It means she has taken an enormous risk in giving me this, because if I were not to appreciate it, if I were not to see what it represents, it would break something in her. It would confirm all the things she has been told, that her work does not matter, that her care is wasted, that she is not deserving of good things." Holmes placed the small piece of gingerbread in his mouth. He closed his eyes. He did not chew immediately. Instead, he allowed the gingerbread to sit on his tongue, to begin its dissolution, to release its flavours gradually, to communicate its message through taste and sensation, rather than through the mere physical act of consumption. When he finally opened his eyes, they were bright with what might have been tears, though Holmes would never have admitted to tears. "It is excellent," he said. "The spices are perfectly balanced. The texture is precisely right, not too dense, not too crumbly. There is a quality to it that suggests considerable experience, considerable skill. Eleanor's grandmother must have been an exceptional baker. But more importantly," Watson observed, "you have done what Eleanor needed you to do. You have consumed her gift. You have made it a part of yourself. You have communicated through the simple act of eating her gingerbread that it matters, that she matters." "Yes," Holmes said. He retrieved another small piece and ate it more slowly this time, allowing the flavours to unfold across his palate, allowing himself to experience the complexity of what Eleanor had created. "Yes, that is precisely what has occurred, and I find that I am quite moved by this simple act. Not moved in the way that most people are moved, not emotionally, not sentimentally, but moved in the sense of being fundamentally changed by something. My understanding of Eleanor, my recognition of her value, my acknowledgement of her gift, all of these things have been deepened and solidified by the simple act of tasting what she has made." They sat together in the gathering darkness of the evening, the fire burning steadily, the arrangement of white flowers and green foliage creating shadows on the wall that seemed almost alive, almost conscious. Outside, London was settling into Christmas Eve night. People were gathered around their own fires. People were with their families. People were doing what people do on the night before Christmas, exchanging gifts, sharing warmth, attempting to create meaning and connection in the midst of the ordinary chaos of their lives. "Do you think," Watson asked after a long silence, "that Eleanor understands what today meant? That she understands how profoundly her act of courage has affected us?" "I think," Holmes said carefully, "that Eleanor is beginning to understand. She is beginning to see that her work matters, that her kindness is recognized, that her existence makes a difference in the world. But this understanding is fragile. It is new. It requires reinforcement. It requires, over time, consistent evidence that she is valued. And I think that is why she will become important to us, Watson. Not because she is a mystery to be solved, but because she is a person who needs to be reminded, again and again, that she matters." "Then we will remind her," Watson said simply. "Whenever she doubts, we will remind her. Whenever her mother criticizes her work, whenever she hears the voice of judgment, whenever she is tempted to believe that she is not deserving of good things, we will be there to remind her that she is, that we see her, that her work matters." "Yes," Holmes agreed. "That is exactly what we will do." The fire burned lower as the evening progressed into night. Holmes continued to eat the gingerbread slowly, thoughtfully, consuming perhaps half of the tin over the course of several hours. Each piece was savoured, Each piece was allowed to communicate its message fully before being swallowed. It was, Watson realised, the most reverent consumption of food he had ever witnessed Holmes engage in, and this despite Holmes's stated indifference to eating, his typical consumption of food as a mere practical necessity rather than as an experience to be appreciated. Around 10 o'clock, Mrs. Hudson came up to tend the fire. She did not comment on the half-empty tin of gingerbread on the mantelpiece. She did not ask where it had come from or what significance it held, but Watson noticed that she handled it carefully, and that when she replaced it on the mantelpiece after adding coal to the fire, she positioned it exactly as Holmes had positioned it, so that the symbols would catch the light, so that the message would remain visible. "The florist," Mrs. Hudson said as she was preparing to leave. "The young woman on Marylebone Road. She's a good sort, isn't she?" Holmes looked up from his contemplation of the fire. "She is, Mrs. Hudson. She's very much a good sort." "And she's had a difficult time of it, I'd imagine, with a mother like that." "Yes," Holmes said. "She's had a very difficult time indeed, but perhaps that is beginning to change." Mrs. Hudson nodded, satisfied. She had not asked how Holmes knew about Eleanor's mother, had not asked how he had come to know anything about Eleanor at all. Mrs. Hudson had learned, over the years, that Holmes knew things through means that defied easy explanation, and that it was generally best not to ask too many questions about how he came by his knowledge. After she left, the house settled into that particular kind of quiet that exists only on Christmas Eve. A quiet that is not empty, but full of anticipation, full of the sense that something significant is about to occur. Outside, the city was sleeping. The streets were empty. The fog hung suspended in the air like a benediction, muffling sound, creating a kind of isolation that felt almost sacred. "Watson," Holmes said at last, breaking the long silence that had fallen between them, "I want you to understand something. What we did today, what you did in particular with your simple compliment, your recognition of Eleanor's talent, that was not a small thing. That was an act of profound kindness. Eleanor has spent years believing that she was not deserving of recognition, not deserving of appreciation, not deserving of anything good, and you walked into her shop and treated her as if she were a person whose work mattered. Do you understand the significance of that?" "I was simply offering her a genuine compliment," Watson said. "Precisely," Holmes said, "and that is what made it significant. There was no ulterior motive. There was no desire to manipulate or control. You simply saw something beautiful and acknowledged it. That is a radical act, Watson. That is an act of genuine kindness, offered without expectation of return. That is the thing that Eleanor has been needing all her life, to have someone see her, truly see her, and tell her that what they see is good." Watson did not know what to say to this. He had never thought of his simple compliment as being significant in any way. He had offered it because it was true, because Eleanor's work was genuinely beautiful, because it seemed appropriate to acknowledge beauty when one encountered it. But now, understanding what that simple acknowledgement had meant to Eleanor, understanding how it had contributed to her finding the courage to send the gingerbread, to create the cipher, to place her gratitude in their hands, he began to see it differently. "We are all," Holmes continued, "hungry for acknowledgement in this way. We all need to be seen, to be valued, to be told that our existence matters, and yet society has constructed itself in such a way that this acknowledgement is often withheld. Parents criticize their children rather than praise them, believing that criticism will make them stronger, more resilient. Employers demand work without recognizing effort. The world teaches us that recognition is something that must be earned, rather than something that is our right as human beings, as people who have existed and attempted and tried. And yet," Watson said slowly, "Eleanor's mother has withheld recognition so completely that Eleanor has come to believe she deserves it to be withheld. She has internalized the judgment so thoroughly that she judges herself more harshly than anyone else ever could." "Yes," Holmes said, "that is the cruelty of it. The cruelty of sustained, consistent, unrelenting criticism is that eventually the person being criticized internalizes the voice of the critic. Eleanor's mother does not need to criticize her anymore. Eleanor criticizes herself. Eleanor has become her own harshest judge." "How do we help her change that?" Watson asked. "How do we help her begin to believe that she deserves recognition, that she deserves good things?" "We show up," Holmes said simply. "We visit the shop. We purchase flowers. We notice her work and acknowledge it. We treat her as a person who matters. Over time, perhaps, Eleanor will begin to believe what we're showing her, that she is valuable, that her work is significant, that she is deserving of good things. It will not be quick, it will not be easy, but it is necessary. The night deepened. Around midnight, Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the window. He pulled back the curtain and looked out onto Baker Street, which was sleeping, which was silent, which was wrapped in fog and darkness and the particular peace that comes only on Christmas Eve night. "Do you know what I think Christmas means?" Holmes asked, still looking out the window. "I think it means that for one night, for one day, the world pauses. People gather together. People acknowledge their connection to one another. People attempt, however imperfectly, to show kindness to those around them. And for a moment, just a moment, the world feels like it is based on something other than greed and competition and the relentless pursuit of profit. For a moment, it feels like it is based on connection, on love, on the simple recognition that we matter to one another. And then," Watson observed, "the day ends and the world returns to its ordinary patterns and people forget." "Many people do forget," Holmes agreed, "but not all. Some people remember. Some people carry the memory of that connection forward, and they attempt in their own small ways to extend that connection beyond the single day of Christmas. And that, Watson, is what Eleanor is doing. She is remembering the moment when I showed her kindness. She is extending that kindness forward by creating beautiful flowers for people, by dedicating herself to her craft, by refusing to allow her mother's criticism to silence her inner voice. She is, in her own way, honouring the connection between us by continuing to do good work, by continuing to create beauty, by continuing to believe that such things matter." Watson found himself deeply moved by this assessment. It revealed a side of Holmes, a philosophical side, a spiritual side, a side that believed in the importance of human connection and human kindness, that he had sensed but had never quite seen displayed so openly. "Then we will remember as well," Watson said. "We will remember Eleanor. We will remember the Gingerbread Cipher. We will remember what it means to be truly seen by another person, and we will extend that recognition to others in whatever ways we can. We will attempt, however imperfectly, to see people as they truly are and to acknowledge the value in what they do, in who they are." "Yes," Holmes said, turning away from the window. "That is exactly right. That is, I think, the only meaningful response to kindness, to receive it, to understand it, to allow oneself to be changed by it, and then to pass it forward, to give to others what we have been given." The clock on the mantelpiece chimed midnight. Christmas Eve had ended. Christmas Day had begun. Holmes retrieved the tin of gingerbread from the mantelpiece and set it on the small table beside his chair. He looked at it for a long moment, and Watson saw in his expression something that looked very much like gratitude. "Eleanor Hartwell," Holmes said quietly, "has given us a gift far greater than gingerbread. She has given us a reminder of why this work of observation, this work of understanding, this work of connecting with the people who cross our paths, matters. She has given us proof that a single act of kindness, a single moment of being truly seen, can change a person's life. She's given us permission to believe that we matter, that what we do matters, that our existence makes a difference." He looked at Watson directly. "Thank you," he said, "for being here, for being the kind of person who could see Eleanor's work and acknowledge it without hesitation, for being the kind of person who recognizes beauty and kindness in the world. You're a good man, Watson, and I do not offer such assessments lightly." Watson felt tears come to his eyes, actual tears, which was rare for him. "Thank you," he said, "for showing me in turn that kindness is not weakness, that recognition of beauty is not sentimentality, that the work we do, the people we encounter, the connections we form, all of these things matter. You have taught me something important today, Holmes, something that I will carry with me long after this Christmas has passed." They sat together in the warming glow of the fire as Christmas Day began. The white flowers and green foliage of Eleanor's arrangement seemed to glow with their own light, beautiful and alive and present. The gingerbread tin sat on the table, partially consumed, holding within it the message that Eleanor had encoded, a message of gratitude, of connection, of the simple human need to be seen and valued. Outside, London slept. The fog continued to settle softly on the streets and buildings and sleeping people. The frost remained hard and bright on the windows, and somewhere on Marylebone Road, in a small florist's shop, a young, A woman named Eleanor Hartwell was sleeping peacefully, perhaps, for the first time in years. She was sleeping with the knowledge that she had been truly seen, that her work mattered, that the kindness she had shown, the sacrifice she had made, the beauty she had created, all of these things were recognized and valued by people who mattered to her, even if only briefly, even if only on a single Christmas Eve morning. The gingerbread was gone, consumed, internalized, made a part of Holmes himself. But the cipher remained, the message remained, the memory remained. And in the heart of Sherlock Holmes, who had built his life on observation and deduction and the pursuit of logical truth, there had been planted something else, the understanding that sometimes the greatest mysteries are not the ones that require solving, but the ones that require receiving. The greatest mysteries are the mysteries of human kindness, of human connection, of human beings reaching out to one another and saying, in whatever language they can manage, I see you. You matter. You are worthy of good things. And on that Christmas morning, as the fire burned and the flowers bloomed their silent beauty, Holmes and Watson sat together in the knowledge that they had been part of something that mattered, something small, something beautiful, something that would ripple outward into the world and change it, just slightly, just enough to make a difference. The gingerbread cipher had been solved, the mystery had been resolved, and yet, somehow, everything remained mysterious, everything remained magical, everything remained full of possibility.